Good evening to everyone who is joining us online. I am calling to order the May 4th, 2020 meeting of the Menlo Park Planning Commission. Before I go into calling roll, let me give a setup for tonight's virtual Planning Commission meeting. And what I want to acknowledge at the outset is that public hearings are and can be challenging to track when you're in person. Rest assured, we realize that they are challenging to track, especially so in a virtual environment like we have here. For some, this will be a new process. For some, it will be a well-worn process. Rest assured that we'll be walking through the different steps of the meeting to make sure that there's ample time for input, there's ample time for questions, and all of the normal ways that we have for giving dialogue, instruction, discussion will also pertain to this meeting. What I will be doing as chair is primarily as a traffic cop, essentially making sure that there is the deliberative asking of questions, clear responses, making sure the motions are clear, the votes, anything that has to do with mechanics of the meeting. And with that in mind, even more than in a regular in-person meeting, I do ask that communications flow through me as a chair to be able to direct them and work with technical staff that we have that'll be managing the meeting as well. So I'll be happy to recognize anyone who wishes to speak, and then we'll direct it on from there. So with that, allow me to introduce Mr. Tapia and see if there's any guidance or mechanics that he wants to give at this point before I call roll.
Thank you, Chair Barnes. Again, my name is Leo Tapia, and I will be clerking this meeting tonight. So just as a kind of general reminder for everyone, the Chair Barnes, will be on at all times. His microphone will be on at all times, so he will be a constant throughout the meeting. And then just for the commissioners, again, if you have a comment or question, at that time, please turn on your webcam and your microphone and ask your question or comment at that time. And then once you do finish with that comment or question, please turn off your webcam and your microphone, please. And then for those who are presenting tonight, please, if you have the capability, turn on your webcam and then also your microphone during your allotted presentation time. And then another staff member behind the scenes will assign you controls to the keyboard and the mouse, so that way you can kind of run through your presentation if you do have one at that time. And then those for members of the public during the public comment period, there will be an opportunity for you to speak and or write in a question. So on your screen, for those who are attendees, you will see a hand icon. You can either click on that, and then we will go ahead and allow you an opportunity to speak, and or alternatively, you do have the option to write in the question, and we as staff can see the question and verbally announce it for you. So again, just in summary, if you are not presenting or not speaking at that time, please turn off your webcam and your microphone so we can streamline this whole process. And with that, that should be everything from my end. So back to you, Chair Barnes.
Thank you, I appreciate that. So I'll proceed to call roll. And by calling roll, I will call the name of each individual commissioner. When I call your name, if you are present, please hit your video button, and I will acknowledge you when I have visually seen you. Starting with Commissioner Doran. Good evening.
Here.
Commissioner Doran is present. Commissioner Riggs. Commissioner Riggs is present. Commissioner DeCarty. Commissioner DeCarty is present. Commissioner Kale.
I'm here.
Good evening. Commissioner Kale is present. Commissioner Kennedy. Commissioner Kennedy is present. Commissioner Tate. Commissioner Tate is absent, and I, Commissioner Andrew Barnes, are present. So to recap, it's present are Commissioner Doran, Riggs, DeCarty, Kale, Kennedy, and Barnes. Absent is Commissioner Tate. Thank you. So with that, I will move to reports and announcements. Good evening, Ms. Sandmeyer.
Good evening, Chair Barnes and Commissioners. So as an update, starting today, construction is allowed again in the city as long as safety protocols are followed. And the city will also be doing building inspections starting in a phased approach. And then tomorrow evening at 5 p.m., the City Council will be doing interviews for potential planning commissioners. And that concludes my reports and announcements, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Sandmeyer? Commissioner DeCardi.
Hi, Ms. Sandmeyer, and thank you to staff again for pulling these planning commission meetings together. I know they're hard to do. And that's great news about being able to open up for business. And I know you're working hard to do that, keeping everybody safe. I have a question along those lines, which is the planning department or the city or who is considering what supports for our businesses as they are eventually allowed to open and where they are likely to have to maintain social distancing? And specifically, we could imagine scenarios where they would have limited number of people inside their stores, but they might be able to serve more customers if they were allowed to have their merchandise outside in some way, or if they were able to have additional seating outside. And so I wonder how the city is considering changing standards for perhaps parking, like on Santa Cruz Avenue or in other places where there are businesses on street side, or other measures. And if they are doing that, are they doing that so that businesses could know in advance as much as possible what to plan for, so that when they eventually can open, they can hit the ground running, given that so many of them are in such bad shape right now?
Yeah, I don't believe there's been much work on trying to figure out how businesses would open. I think it may be a while. It of course depends on the county health order and state regulations. And then after that, it would go to the city council. But for now, I think it's just the kind of outdoor construction type of work that's allowed. But we will, start considering that type of, as we get further along, figuring out how businesses can start reopening.
Through the chair, if I could ask a follow-up.
Yes, please.
So I guess two questions. One is, perhaps this is something that the Planning Commission could have a conversation about at a future meeting. It seems like it would at least touch on matters that were in our purview. And then the second is, if there is an individual business owner who would like to get clarification on this from the city, who do they ask? Where do they go?
Well, I can certainly get more information from the planning management team and follow up on that. I think for now, certainly people can call the planning office. We're open for kind of virtual question and answers. But yeah, I don't believe there's much of a plan right now, but I can definitely get you more information for next week.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Doran.
Hi, Ms. Sandmeyer. I would like to ask my usual question, which may be more acute now that construction is going to be allowed again. Is the city accepting new building permit applications at this time?
I don't think that they're accepting right now, but that will be a next step. I think right now there's kind of a, there's a backlog of building permit applications that have been submitted and ones that have been approved and that will require the inspections. But we're working towards that since construction's allowed now.
Yeah, if I may follow up.
Yes, please.
Do you have a target date for when you'll be able to accept new applications?
I think that's also going to be a phased approach. I think, it starts out with the smaller applications, but I can get back to you on that next week, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Kale.
If I may, I believe that at least the building department is accepting applications online at this point, or they're ramping up to that. So I think that is possible now. They just won't be able to issue permits for a while. I was on a Zoom call with the chief billing official this week, and that's what they're working towards. And they will be phasing in-person counter meetings soon. But as for now, you can submit projects online. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions for Ms. Sandmeyer? Seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Sandmeyer. I'll proceed now to public comment. Before I call for general public, for this portion of public comment, Mr. Tapia, do you have any mechanics instructions for anyone who would like to submit public comment on how to do it?
Yeah, for those who are attending the meeting virtually, you do have the option, if you would like, to submit a public comment at this time by clicking on the hand icon on your screen. Or alternatively, there is a question tab on your menu where you have an opportunity to submit a written question, and we as staff can read that question aloud for you. And at this moment, I am not seeing any hands or questions.
Great. Let me call formally for public comment. This is item D on this evening's agenda. It's under public comment. The public may address the commission on any subject not listed on the agenda in items listed under the consent calendar. Each speaker may address the commission once under public comment for a limit of 3 minutes. Please clearly state your name and address or political jurisdiction in which you live. The commission cannot act on items not listed on the agenda, and therefore the commission cannot respond to non-agenda issues brought up under public comment other than to provide general information. So to anyone who is in the audience who is here to give public comment on an item that's not listed on this evening's agenda, now is the time to come forward. If you are here specific to an item on this evening's agenda, wait until that agenda comes up. Rest assured, I will call for public comment on that specific agenda item. You'll have the opportunity to give your public comment then. That said, is there anyone with a hand up for this public comment?
Not seeing anything yet.
We'll give it one more moment, then I'll close public comment. Correct, we have no other hands up.
Correct, no other comments at this time.
So with that, I will close public comment and move to item E on this evening's agenda, consent calendar. This is E1, approval of the minutes from the April 6th, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. Looking for a motion, or should someone have revisions, please offer them. Commissioner DeCardi.
I would move that we approve as submitted.
We have a first from DeCardi as submitted. Commissioner Riggs.
I will second the motion.
First from DeCardi, second from Riggs. All in favor. What I will do is, again, call out commissioner names. We've got a first from DeCardi, second from Riggs. So I have your two. Commissioner Doran? If it's affirmative, just give me a thumbs up. Commissioner Doran's affirmative. Commissioner Kale? Commissioner Kale is affirmative. Commissioner Kennedy? Commissioner Kennedy? Commissioner Kennedy is oh, so you are abstaining?
Yes.
You're an abstention. Okay. So we've got Kennedy as an abstention. Commissioner Tate is absent. And Commissioner Barnes is affirmative. So to read that vote again, voting yes are Doran, Riggs, DeCarty, Kale. Voting in Barnes. Abstaining is Commissioner Kennedy, and Commissioner Tate is absent. Let the record show. Thank you. Moving from consent calendar, if there's a commissioner with their mic unmuted, could you please mute? Thank you. Moving to public hearing portion of tonight's agenda. This is item F1. This is a development agreement annual review for Facebook, One Hacker Way and One Facebook Way. This is the annual review of the property owner's good faith compliance with the terms of the development agreement for their East Campus, West Campus, and Facebook campus expansion projects. Good evening to, who's the lead on this? Mr. Parada, I believe. Good evening, Mr. Parada.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Barnes and members of the commission. It's good to be here with you all tonight. I do have a brief staff presentation, which right now we have the applicant's presentation up. So if we could move to the staff, thank you. So I have a really brief presentation that I'll give tonight to provide a little overview of the topic, and then turn it over to the applicant, who also has a presentation to give to the Planning Commission tonight. And so what we're here for is the annual review of Facebook's development agreement. So there are 3 development agreements. They're outlined in the staff report. This is the 2019 annual review. And so I'll go into it real quick. If I can. There we go. Okay. So for the commission and members of the public's benefit, I have a map up here to identify the 3 sites that we're talking about. So there is the East Classic Campus. That was the first site that Facebook occupied. Its development agreement and conditional development permit were approved in 2012 initially. Table 1 of the staff report outlines the status of that development agreement. And as you'll see in that table in the staff report, there are no items that are currently in progress. All the one-time actions or ongoing activities are deemed complete for this year based on staff analysis. And I should back up really quickly and just mention that the report outlines the development agreement's compliance with one-time actions and ongoing activities. So the development agreements are broken down into items that are one-time actions or ongoing annual activities. And so you'll see that throughout the report and the attachments to the reports that go into more detail. Following the East Campus, the West Campus was the next project that was essentially known as Building 20. That was approved in the spring of 2013. Table 2 in the staff report outlines that campus's development agreement. And I would like to note that the title of that table is mislabeled. It should read West Campus. It says Campus Expansion Project. My apologies. The data are correct, but the table is mislabeled in the staff report. As you'll see, once again, that DA, no items currently are on in progress. They're all either completed or conditional, no action required at this time. The most recent development agreement is the West Campus Expansion Development Agreement that was initially approved in fall of 2016. Subsequently amended in fall of 2017 for some changes to Building 22 specifically, and then recently amended for some modifications to the proposed future hotel to be occupied by Citizen M. That went for the council in early 2020. Table 3 outlines the status of the development agreement for the campus expansion project. As you'll see, there's a number of in-progress items that is expected as the West Campus Expansion Project is ongoing phase multi-building project. And so it is still under construction, kind of in the second phase where Building 22 is getting close to occupancy. currently on hold construction due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so moving forward, the recommended actions before the Planning Commission tonight are included in Attachment A. The first recommended action is that the Planning Commission find that the annual review of the development agreement does not have a potential environmental impact under the California Environmental Quality Act. And then the second finding is that staff recommends that the Planning Commission find that that Facebook has implemented the provisions of the East Campus, West Campus, and campus expansion development agreements in good faith compliance through the 2019 development agreement review year. And one thing to note is that typically the development agreements have been done on an annual basis for the period from October through September, so spanning 2 calendar years. For 2019, the trip cap review for the East Campus was done separately from the West Campus DA and the campus expansion DA. And that took into account the full year of 2018. So for this year, the development agreements were reviewed, and specifically trip cap compliance for each campus was reviewed for the full 2019 calendar year. So staff recommends moving forward that we use the calendar year for the review for all DA items. And so we'll be implementing that for the 2020 review as well. So likely bringing it in the early part of 2021 for the Planning Commission's review for that year's DA annual review. So that concludes my report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we can turn it over to the applicant for their presentation.
Great. So before I call for fellow commissioner clarifying questions, let me walk through the steps here because we are virtual, and I want to make sure everyone is aware of the process we're going to go through. We just heard from Mr. Parada outlining what it is we're looking to do and any clarifications to the staff report. From there, we'll go to clarifying questions from commissioners. From there, to staff, to Mr. Parada about what he said. And then we'll go to the applicant for their presentation, come back to fellow commissioners for any questions to the applicant, clarifying questions about that. I'll open up for public comment. After public comment, bring it back for final discussion and then a motion and a vote relative to what Mr. Parada just laid out. So with that, and with that process, are there any commissioners with questions to Mr. Parada? I do have a question for you. Maybe in the past I hadn't, it's quite possible I hadn't read the recommended actions closely enough. I see the actions 1 and 2, and it isn't my recollection that in the past we were making the findings that the review of the DAs don't meet the definition of a project under CEQA. That's something we've always done, but it just wasn't called out specifically in the manner that you called it out. Is that part of the DA review customarily?
So great question. It is part of the DA review. I mean, it's part of any project that goes to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission would have to identify whether or not the project needs a CEQA or California Environmental Quality Act finding. So in this case, it has been in the previous DA annual reviews, at least the last year. The 2019 or the 2018, excuse me, annual review had this same language. So it is a required item. All of the development agreements are associated with projects that had an environmental impact report that was certified. So the campus expansion project had an EIR, so did the West Campus and the East Campus. And so effectively, most of these DA items, excuse me, all these DA or development agreement items would have been reviewed as part of that environmental review as well. So anything that is an infrastructure item would have been captured in that environmental review as part of the project review. So this is a custom, this is a typical finding that's required for these reviews.
Great, thank you. Seeing no other questions for Mr. Parada, I'll move to the applicant. to talk to us, give us your presentation. Thank you. Good evening, Mr. O'Shea.
Good evening, commissioners. Can you hear me? See me?
I can.
Great.
You can see it
And
well.
let me make sure I have control of the screen. I do not have control of the screen.
You do. I can see you moving the hand.
Oh, okay.
The down, yeah, the down key to move the mouse. So click on the mouse. Got it?
But I'm not able to move through the, oh, there we go. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. All right, so good evening, commissioners. I'm Fergus O'Shea, Director of Campus Development for Facebook here in the Bay Area. So I'd like to start by thanking the staff for putting on this meeting tonight virtually and for putting together a very comprehensive report. It outlines every item of our 3 development agreements in detail and where the status is. It's very comprehensive. I also want to thank you, commissioners, for your continued public service, especially now during these tough times. So I hope you're all keeping, your families are all keeping safe and healthy. I'm joined tonight by several of my colleagues. I have Maya Perkins, Monica Wong, Mike Alba, Lawrence Weezy, and Juan Salazar. There's a big team of us working on all the initiatives that are included in these development agreements. So I may not, if you have a particular question where I may not know the exact answer or need additional information, we may call on one of them. But tonight I'd like to give you a quick overview, highlight some of the key items of each of our agreements, and I want to discuss a little bit of timing relative to some of the latest improvements. Of course, Facebook has made a lot of contributions in the community, but what I'm here tonight is just to highlight specific items related to our Menlo Park development agreements, and I'm looking forward to coming back next week. We're going to be talking about the community center proposal, which is going to be a study session, which actually isn't part of our development agreements, but we'll be giving a presentation on that next Monday, so I'm looking forward to that. So, as Kyle said, we moved to, let me go up one. Chair Barnes, can you tell me if the 2011 slide is up, or is it still on the title page?
I see the title page, Menlo Park Development Agreements, Community Benefits Update, title page.
There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to hit on some key highlights of each one of the development agreements. So in 2011, we moved to Menlo Park. We moved from Palo Alto. We moved into the old Sun Microsystems campus. At the time, our initial development agreement, some of the highlights were we built the undercrossing was existent but hadn't been activated ever, I believe, underneath the 84. This is the tunnel that connects the community to the bayfront property without having to go through the intersection. At the time, we put together the trip cap, which monitors the amount of traffic which comes in and out of the site as part of our EIR. Then there was projects around the Bay Trail improvements. At the time, we funded a community fund for Belhaven and set up our internship program, continued with job fairs and other financial commitments. At the time as well, there was significant road mitigations and utility upgrade projects as part of the 2011 development agreement. I just wanted to highlight Facebook Academy. So currently in its 9th year, this is a scholarship program. We've had over 140 students come through the program over the years. And many have now graduated and move on. So it's still a program that exists today, nearly 10 years later. So in 2014, we signed our, what was then called the West Campus. This was our MPK 20. This was our first ground up project. It was the Frank Geary design building. It was the first one we had built in Menlo Park. At the time, this development agreement included additional funding towards the community fund. There was an extension, another trip cap that was put in place, monitor traffic coming in out of that side, continual investments in the job fairs. There was some public access area agreements relative to the connections to the Bay Trail through the property. And then one of the more significant items that we had at the time was the old site was, it was an old Ray Camp site, and there was significant cleanup, and as part of the project, we cleaned up, we spent quite a bit of time cleaning up a lot of contaminated soil that was actually in the project at the time. As part of that project, we had below market rate developments. We didn't have development, it was as part of the St. Anton development, and we funded the 15 units of affordable housing at the time. And then it was ongoing financial commitments associated with MPK 20. In 2016 was the largest development we have, where that was the approval of MPK 21 and MPK 22 and the Bayfront Hotel, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second. That development agreement was very comprehensive. We had grown quite a bit in those 5 years as a development agreement, and it was really structured in 5 different categories related to transportation, housing, community, environment, and financial benefits for the city. So some of the highlights of that included Belhaven traffic calming study, which is now some of the temporary measures are being put in place. There was a lot of the improvements along Chilco Street, along the perimeter of our property. The first phases of those are complete, and the next phases are about to be signed off, and there'll be continued phases of that project this year. There was the investments we made into the Dumbarton Corridor study, the Bayfront pedestrian bridge, which I'm going to show you in a second, and then other local and regional transportation investments. And related to the community, so as part of that agreement, there was an ongoing commitment to funding of the Community Fund Scholarship Program, funding for the Belhaven Pool. One of the more significant investments that we're making, and we're about to start construction on, is a public park area, which ties between MPK 21 and 22. That park will be built. It's going to, now we're back up again, we're under construction. I'm going to show you some pictures of it in a second. There was additional funding that was towards the Bedwell Bayfront Park. And of course, there was the agreement to build a hotel on the Bayfront campus, what we call the Bayfront campus. And that hotel passed. We're still in the process of negotiating ground lease. We're just finalizing terms with Citizen M, and they have the project got approved by the council a couple of months ago. So that's going to move forward in the next year. So this is a picture of the MPK 22 park. So this is the area between MPK 21 and 22. This was on the site of the old TE factory, so building 305. The good news is that at the end of last year, the TE left Menlo Park. They had left, they left a little bit ahead of schedule, which is allowing us to move forward with the public park a lot faster than we had anticipated. So if you've been out there over the last couple of months obviously before we went into lockdown, you'll see that the building 305 is nearly demolished. And now that we're up and running as of today, which is great, we're going to continue with the construction of this whole park. And you can see here the connections between 21 and 22, which is the public access area, comes off at Chilco Street and it ties onto the bike and pedestrian bridge, which I wanted to show you a picture of. This is looking from the bridge from the north and south. The bridge was in, the good news on the bridge is that we were waiting for over a year to get approvals from PG&E because it crosses, part of the bridge crosses under transmission lines. I'm really glad to say that I've signed the agreement with PG&E in the last couple of weeks, which is going to allow us to start construction of the bike and pedestrian bridge. Will be open next year. So also inside in the other 3 pillars were the financial, the housing, and environmental. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. The obviously there's yearly and there was one-time payments to the city's ongoing property tax guarantees. Good news on the property tax guarantees is that even the initial assessments on building 21 were twice as high as we had originally estimated. With the hotel, there is transit occupancy tax guarantees to the city minimum. As part of our housing bucket, one of the programs which I really was proud that we put together and that we're currently in the process of expanding was a subsidy to turn market rate housing into below market rate housing for teachers for local teachers. And that was a program now that we've had up and running for 3 or 4 years, and we were looking to expand again in the future. So I'm really proud of that program, and there was a really great benefit to keeping teachers in the area. And then as part of our environmental, the MPK 21 and 22, we have our Blackwater recycling system. That system was in the final throes of being commissioned until we went into lockdown. So we're looking forward to opening back up in the coming months and finalizing that system. So with that, that's my presentation. This is a picture of that class of graduating students from the Facebook Academy in 2019. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any questions for Mr. O'Shea before I call for public comment, clarifying questions? Seeing no commissioners with questions, I'll now turn to public comment and first look to Mr. Tapia to tell me about who we may or may not have in queue for public comment.
Thank you, Chair Barnes. Let's see. Again, for those who are just joining us, members of the public, you do have an opportunity to ask a question or a comment at this time by clicking on the green hand icon on your screen. Or alternatively, you do have a questions tab on your menu, which you can open up and type in your question, which then staff will read aloud if you pursue that option instead. So again, just click on the green hand icon if you do have a question, or write in your question. And at this moment, I am not seeing any hands or questions from the attendees.
I'll give it one moment, then I will close public comment. See no other hands up. I will now proceed to close public comment on this agenda item, bring it back up to the virtual dais, and look to my fellow commissioners for commentary, additional questions to Facebook on this agenda item. Commissioner Riggs.
Yes, thank you. I have maybe 3 questions, and perhaps starting, if I may, a question of staff.
Please.
On page 5 of the staff report, a fairly significant note regarding the trip count is that with the Chilco Campus Transit Center opened, this is anticipated to increase ridership of the shuttles and trams due to consolidation of the shuttle routes in a convenient location and increased efficiency. And I wondered if Mr. Parada, would you comment on primarily, how do we know that this location and efficiency will, how is staff confident in this transit center making a measurable change? I'll just note from my perspective that the campus is quite large, and so there are still challenges and a certain amount of time involved in getting ultimately to your office.
Certainly, so thank you for the question. So we will be monitoring this year to see, well, this year may be a little bit different from a travel pattern standpoint, but what we would have been looking at is to see if there were changes as a result of the Chilco Campus Transit Center being open. I would say that staff's kind of assessment here is that it does provide a consolidated transit center that then links to the more localized trams between the campuses. So for an employee that might have a need to go to multiple buildings, there's a possibility that that could increase ridership, where at the end of the day, you might end up at a different building than you arrived at, and then you can use the transit center to kind of help get on a more regional shuttle. So we also think that that transit center, coupled with the opening of 22, since the transit center is closer to 22, would also potentially increase ridership on the longer regional shuttles. And that'd be certainly something that we would be looking at throughout the next year, is the utilization of that transit center. It is definitely the transit center, coupled with many other potential improvements to reduce the trips and lower that exceedances during those morning peak hours. So certainly not just one item that we're looking at as ways to bring it into compliance.
So that follows with your next paragraph, which is that occupancy at building 22 will increase capacity at West Campus and therefore likely reduce employment density in the East Campus. The history so far has been there's never enough space to house the people. So where does staff confidence come from that the West Campus will reduce the parking demand related to employee count from the old campus?
So that might be a question that's better directed to the applicant for some more detailed follow-up, but I will say that a lot of that comes from discussions with the applicant about utilization of their space in the East Campus and the West Campus, and what or who would be moving into building 22 once it comes online. And so certainly the de-densification of the East Campus or the Menlo Park campuses is a conversation that we've been having with Facebook team.
Well, that's certainly fair. Through the chair, may I ask Fergus for a response?
Yes, please.
Good evening, Commissioner Riggs. Thanks for the question. So a couple of points on Classic Campus and the employee count and traffic count. So the good thing about Classic Campus is that we did a really good job in it, so everybody wants to be there. So we've always had probably the maximum number of employees inside that campus, but what we have done is, over the last couple of years, we have begun and started the process of moving people out of Menlo Park. So now we have campuses in San Francisco, in Fremont, in Sunnyvale, and Mountain View. And what we've done is, our plan has been to de-densify parts of Menlo Park on the campuses to get them to a place where not only are we going to continue to be in conformance with the trip cap or very close to it, but also come to a really good density for employees. So we're confident that even over the last couple of years, as we've grown and grown, we've actually brought down the overage of the trip cap. Like we did last year, we were up over 800 trips. This year in that AM peak hour, we were down 200, 300 trips. So we've done a lot to continue to expand our TDM program. Obviously, this year is going to be very different for us. You know, we obviously aren't, there's nobody there right now. We're probably going to have a very slow kind of re-entry back to work. We've announced that we won't be holding any events over 50 people between now and at least June of next year. We're also probably going to take a very close look at our visitor policy. The problem with Classic Campus has never really been the number of employees, it's the number of visitors that we have there every day. And everybody comes at around the same time, even though this is the AM trip cap, but generally the parking issue is during the day, and we've been able to control the AM and PM because of the number of employees. More of the parking issues we're having there is during the day, and this is specific to the AM peak, I believe. So that's a lot of things that we're doing, but I anticipate that we're going to continue to de-densify Classic and to make sure that we have at the right employee count inside in the Classic, so we're not tripping the trip cap as we move forward.
Well, thank you very much. It must be a bit of a relief to have options at this point.
Yeah. I mean, we were behind. You know, we spent over in the last couple of years. We're definitely locating for a lot more people closer to where they live. The options of San Francisco, Fremont were all new in the past, year and a half. So that's also helping with the traffic situation.
By the way, I want to congratulate you not only on actually getting an answer out of PG&E, few people actually achieve that, and signing the agreement, but also on getting the gray water system, I think it's a black water system, up and ready for commissioning. That's a wonderful achievement and something I think we had really hoped for back in 2014. So along with your other wonderful contributions to our town. I would like to ask a couple of questions. One regarding the Dumbarton Rail. The comment in the staff report refers to the initiation in January 2019, I think. And I wondered if you had anything to update us on what is potentially a really game-changing transit alternative to the cars that flood in over the automobile bridge.
Yeah, so we've made significant investments in putting the into the corridor itself. Given everything that's happened over the last month with COVID-19, we are putting the project on somewhat of a pause. We want to see how the project's going to look like over the next couple of months. I don't have more of an update than that right now. I know that the team is going through the environmental review phase, but I don't have an update based on that. I do know that it's probably, we have to wait and we see where we come out of this current situation for what the future steps of our investments are going to look like.
During the year, the EIR was accomplished, and the partnership agreement is still moving forward, or was that put on hold before February, March?
No, everything was, as far as I know, and I would have to, if there is a very specific item, I'd have to get Winsome Brown to follow up with your project manager, because Winsome's more involved in day-to-days of that particular project. My understanding was everything was moving along until recently, and then with the COVID-19, over the past couple of months, they are taking a pause to evaluate the current situation before deciding on the next steps. That's the only update I have right now, and I'd be happy to put you in touch, and the city transportation manager might have more information. I'm not sure, but that's all I'm afraid I'm able to share this with you.
Oh, yes, I appreciate that. I'd love to know more. Speaking of traffic, I can't help but observe, I am committed to go up to San Mateo a couple of times a week. And so I know Highway 101 particularly well the last 6 weeks. The wide open lanes, the rather odd 55-mile-an-hour speed limit that absolutely no one pays any attention to because there's no visible purpose. And Caltrans, by the way, I did ask them about 3 weeks ago, and they said we couldn't possibly answer any questions right now. So now that this traffic impact is so evident to all of us, is Facebook considering when the stay-at-home orders are relaxed sufficiently for you to use all this fine office space that you've been building, will there be a new level of commuting from home, reflecting what we've learned over the last 6 weeks?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, we've always kind of had somewhat of an informal work from home policy. What we're doing though is we're studying it. We're doing employee surveys right now. We're measuring impacts on productivity from working remotely and what that's doing to our business. We're very used to working virtually anyway, because we're obviously a global organization, we're a global company, we're working across multiple different time zones, so we're pretty used to it. What the long-term implication both is on any formalized work from home or flexible working or place itself is all TBD at this stage. So we are gathering the data. We've done a couple of internal employee surveys. The results of those surveys haven't been published yet. I know I missed the 101. I miss driving to the office. I'd love to. I'd never thought I'd say that, but I do miss going into doing my commute and getting up in the morning, actually going to my place of work. So we'll see what the results are going to look like at this stage. It's still to be determined.
Well, the potholes are still there waiting for you if you did miss them. So. All right, very much appreciate your comment. Thanks, Fergus.
Additional commissioner questions or comments? Good evening, Commissioner DeCarty.
I know Commissioner Kennedy has a question as well after Commissioner Riggs. I want to thank Commissioner Riggs. He touched on 2 points that I wanted to ask, and Mr. O'Shea, thanks for your answers on Dumbarton and on what you've been learning about the next normal in terms of working from home, remote working, and those pieces. I think both of those are really important to follow up on. My only other question was on the housing piece and around the West Campus development agreement around the housing inventory, local supply study, and then once that was completed, the innovation fund. I just wondered where that stood now, especially with the pandemic in terms of completion, the study. Do you anticipate the final will look different than the draft? And then any insight about what may happen with the innovation fund?
So thank you for your question. I'm actually going to ask Maya Perkins, who's managing that particular program, to answer the question. So I will hand it to Maya, if Maya is available.
Hi, can you all hear me and see me?
We can hear you.
You can hear you, Maya. Thanks.
Commissioner DeCarty, thank you for your question. We are moving forward with the Innovation Fund as planned, and we're looking forward to kicking it off soon. We've actually already started funding some of the recommendations, and so as we heard what was going on, we made sure that we weren't delaying the things that we saw that were important. For example, we've started funding ADUs, which is one of the things that was identified as something very important, and we've been using our own money for that. In terms of the study that we should have the final draft within about a month, and so you can look forward to seeing that. And then I know that you've also probably all heard about our $1 billion announcement for housing. This work is really important to us, and the Housing Innovation Fund is but a piece of that, but our company has a really significant commitment to housing.
That's great. Thank you, Ms. Perkins, for the update and for the work in the community. And thank you to the whole team for making yourselves available tonight and for the report. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kennedy, I cannot see you. Do you have audio?
Yeah, here I am. So I just have sort of, through the chair for Fergus, if that's okay. I sort of have a little bit of a follow-up question from him, from Commissioner Riggs on, the new traffic patterns that we've been seeing and the new work patterns that we've been seeing. And I'm wondering if, and you did answer and say that, you're looking into it and you're looking at surveys, but I am wondering, I think that Facebook's been a really good neighbor in the community, and perhaps moving forward, I would love to see, sort of a back of the envelope kind of exercise where before we look at how much physical space we need for office or physical plants, that before we do anything else, we look at, how many of our jobs can be remote, right? And with zero commutation, right? And so then that's taken out, and perhaps there's a bonus to that. But I'm just wondering, you did mention it, and I'm wondering if perhaps you can go further on, maybe a little bit more on maybe how quickly you could navigate when the shelter in place is lifted, how quickly you could navigate getting more people off of the peninsula.
So a couple of things. One, you know, for Facebook as a company, we actually went into the, we started working from home before the county orders came, because we obviously are a global organization and we've been tracking COVID very closely since December of last year. And our offices in Asia had been shut down for several months. So I would say I'm glad, you know, I'm glad that a lot of technology companies in the Bay Area were ahead of the shelter-in-place ordinances, and I think that has helped greatly to what we've seen with COVID-19. For us, it was an easy transition because, you know, a lot of our tools that we have are already available to us, and we're continuing to expand products now beyond our messenger rooms product, for example, that we just announced. So for us, it was easy. It was an easy transition, and as I say, we're already used to spending a lot of time on VC, using instant message, using our internal products for communicating. So for us, it isn't that big transition. I think you make a really good point. I think for traffic, it does obviously help a great deal for working from home. I think, you know, for a lot of people, when we're doing these surveys, one of the questions in the surveys is, what do you like working from home? Well, you know, people say I like the fact that I don't have to commute, you know. So I like the fact that I don't have to commute, but I also miss the work itself and that face-to-face contact that's going to be required. So I would say there's certainly probably going to be a percentage of jobs that can be done virtually. For us, again, like our part of our long-term employee mobility strategy is to get people create offices close to mass transit, close to centers of housing, and that's why we picked the 6 locations around the bay that we're in. Those were, the East Bay was a bigger supply of housing. We picked San Francisco because of the mass transit, and some of a good percentage of our employees live there. Sunnyvale, again, a lot of, you know, it was closer to an employee population. So I think all those things combined with the other efforts we're making, investments, will hopefully lead to a better situation, and we can do our best to try and mitigate the impact of traffic. But what the long-term outlook is going to be for virtual, it's easier for us. We are going to take, and I think Mark has said this publicly, we're going to take a very conservative approach when it comes to returning to work. We have the ability to do that. Other companies, a lot of people don't. They have to be at work, and they don't have the tools that we have. So we're very fortunate in that regard. So far, I think we had our quarterly earnings report last week. I spoke a little bit about it. Productivity is pretty good within the company. So again, we'll have to see and we'll have to measure it, and I'm sure it'll be a factor as we move forward. And I'm sure there'll be more. Our HR team will probably share a lot of those results publicly over what the impact has been and how we might think differently about how people are working. Again, for us, it's a little bit different. We're more used to this. Obviously not full time, but there is a good precedent there for us. But we'll see what the long term is going to be. And as I say, we're studying it, and we're going to see how that affects the workplace. There's the knock-on part of this, as well as what does a returning workplace looks like. There was an article this morning in the New York Times which spoke to this. And a lot of businesses all over the world are obviously trying to figure this out now. This is new territory for a lot of people, and certainly our team and our global design team is thinking about that as well. I'd be happy to share more in the future on that.
All right, thanks.
Mr. Kale.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. One is a follow-up question from Maya Perkins regarding her comment about the ADUs. Is Maya available?
Yes, I'm available. Hi.
Oh, great. Hi. On page 8 of the staff report, it talked about the housing pilot program, and it said one of the first things was the funding SDUs did not fit the pilot program, but I thought you mentioned that you are funding ADUs. If you could clarify that, that would be great.
Yes, and so and I'm wondering if I should pull up page 8 that you're referencing. But the agreement that we have, the DA, has specific things that we can fund with the money. And because the ADU program that we wanted to fund didn't specifically fit into a particular pot, we used separate money to fund the ADUs. And I can pull up the staff report so that I can speak directly to it. I can also follow up with you.
And Maya, while you're looking that up, I can give, I can put on my second hat and just give a little update on the status of some of the ADU projects that we funded. I do have an update on those. So I sit on the board of Rebuilding Together Peninsula, and Rebuilding Together Peninsula is one of the agencies that actually received some of the funding for the ADU units. And East Palo Alto was one of the first cities to go through the whole process of updating all the zoning language and all the land use elements, etc., to allow ADUs. And I know that RTP were a big part of that process, along with a lot of other stakeholders within the general community. And I know that the first couple of those projects were complete this year, and they're looking at completing 2 more of those projects this year. So that's, when Maya's looking that up, I just thought I'd add that piece in.
Thank you.
Do you want to ask your second question while Maya's looking that up?
Sure. Yeah, my second question was actually for you, Fergus. You mentioned that you have employees relocating out of Menlo Park to San Francisco and other areas. I was just curious if you had a sort of a ballpark number of how many people that is or have moved, and then will those people be moving back when I think building 23 opens, or are there additional employees being hired that will fill that space?
Yeah, good question. So the plan was by the end of this year, we would have actually had more space outside of Menlo Park in the Bay Area than in Menlo Park. So as a company, we are growing faster outside of the Bay Area than we are in the Bay Area because of the issues of housing and cost of living, etc. So in other places around the country, our rate of hiring has increased. Now, having said that, we have hired a lot of people over the last couple of years. I don't know our global population is about 48,000 FTEs. About half of those are in the Bay Area, and about 75 or 80% of those are in Menlo Park. And that number, interestingly, has kept pretty consistent over the last 3 years. So that's one of the reasons that the trip cap is really close. And even though we've been hiring thousands of people in the Bay Area over the last few years, we've been able to maintain right at that threshold for our trip cap, because the number of employees in Menlo Park specifically has an increase. So we have now 2 high rises in downtown San Francisco. We have 1.1 million square feet, which is bigger than Classic Campus. We have about 17 buildings that have been leased in Fremont. It's less than 1 million square feet. We've already put teams over there. We have 1 million square feet in Sunnyvale. One of those buildings is 2/3 occupied. So we're continuing to not only to relocate some teams, but we're also, specifically now when we're hiring somebody, for example, that was part of our San Francisco strategy, is when we're hiring, now we have the availability to hire directly into teams for people who live in San Francisco. So again, as part of our longer term strategy, I believe the first couple of years we're going to a place where we're relocating people and specific teams out of there. And now in the next couple of years, we're going to go to a place where those teams will organically probably grow with people who live in that specific city. That's how I envision things moving out. Another part of this is, given what's happened with the flex work program, that people may have the ability to be more flexible in terms of where they work, closer to the office as well. Menlo Park, and it gets back to the question on Classic Campus, the reason, again, that we knew several years ago, we knew we were going to outgrow Menlo Park, and we started growing then more strategically around the Bay. And the goal is to have less employees in Menlo Park and to be able to work within reasonable densities of what we've had, and we've seen the fruition of that over the last year. And obviously we've had a bit of a bump here in the road in terms of, you know, opening up new offices and construction for a couple of months, but we are going to pick up where we took off. And in fact, today with Menlo Park lifting with the county lifting the amending the order, we're going back to work on BK 22 and back to work on BK 62 and 63, which are the gateway projects. So I would say probably in a situation where we're going to steady out in terms of number of employees. If Willow Campus ever gets built, will bring the employee count down by, you know, when those buildings come off commission. But the goal is to kind of, for the next couple of years anyway, Menlo Park population will be kept pretty steady. So that's kind of a long answer, so I hope that kind of answered it.
Well, it sounds like you're doing well by hiring so many people. So it sounds like the staff level in Menlo Park, you're trying to decrease that at the same time you're opening up another building?
We're decreasing the density of employees. So
density. Okay, but the absolute number?
Yeah, what's that?
The absolute number is increasing.
The absolute, we will have more space for more employees, we will. And we won't be, we will have more space for employees when the BK 22 opens up and the BK 62 gate, the second round of gateway. Those are the only major buildings that we will have in Menlo Park. I believe, yeah, I'm thinking about my projects. Yeah, I mean, those are the two that are under construction, and we have no other buildings in the pipe. There's a couple of small buildings like that we may do renovations on. I'm trying to think of one or two maybe, but in the hundreds of employees, but no other major redevelopment beyond what's been approved. Obviously, any growth in the future will be dependent on any future approvals, and right now that would be dependent on the Willow campus, which is in environmental review.
Thank you for the answer.
And Commissioner Kale, I'm on, and I am prepared to respond to your question.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So thank you for it. And you had asked about the ADUs and why it wasn't originally a good fit for the preservation fund. So the preservation fund was specifically for housing preservation, and the ADUs were a building or production program. And so although the ADU project was fantastic, it wouldn't fit the requirements of the preservation pilot program. So we believed in the ADU program. We thought it was fantastic, knew it wasn't a good fit for the preservation fund. So we ended up funding the ADUs with our own money. We also knew that some of the early findings from the housing study were that there was a huge need for ADUs. And although we weren't able to access money from the Innovation Fund, we still wanted to fund it because we knew that it was an identified need and would help with the affordable housing crisis.
Thank you. So it sounds like it didn't work for development item 8. Does funding of the ADUs address another one of the development agreement items?
It is a lot. We're not using it towards a development agreement. And so the ADUs that we've already funded, we are not planning to retroactively apply them for future development agreement. I think that it is something that is important, and it was identified through the local housing study as an important need. And it is something that will probably be contemplated for the Innovation Fund. But that will be a separate pot of money because we're, not tapping into the Innovation Fund before that fund is officially established.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Question from myself for the Facebook team. I'm going to go back to the 2 items related to the Dunbarton, well, the 1712 related to the Dunbarton Transportation Corridor Study, and then from there 7.15 an attachment I, which is that Regional Transportation Forum. And Mr. O'Shea, you had mentioned that things were put on hold due to current situations. The outreach started, generally speaking, it looks like in January of 2019. So there was almost a year of the Regional Transportation Forum, some of the outreach. What did you learn over the course of the year as it relates to the appetite for the program, the feasibility of the program, the intention behind what you might want to see, the partners you had in it, be it plenary or others? What did you learn over the course of the year that flows up until the current abatement and activities?
So Commissioner Barnes, unfortunately, like I'm not, I haven't been as involved in that particular project as I was several years ago. And in fact, I haven't really been tracked yet in that level of detail with plenary group. As I say, like Winsome has been the project manager for it. I'd be happy to have her follow up with a more detailed report. The one thing I do know is that they discovered it was going to be very expensive. But I don't know any, I wouldn't be able to provide any more insight beyond that right now on the project. If it's something that the Commission is interested in, we can arrange with staff to either give an update through a report or come back with an information item to Council at some stage, but I don't think I have any more beyond that to share with you this evening, unfortunately. I don't have Winsome on the call either, she wasn't available.
And you know, there's a cost issue. Do you know if there's a correlation between Menlo Park headcount from an employee standpoint and the appetite for Facebook to be a driver in the process? In other words, the benefits associated with it might be X at a certain employee count because you're moving Y number of bodies, opposed to, you know, plans that you might have going forward. Is there a correlation between the two?
Well, we don't have for us, I think it was, we were always really looking, this is a regional investment in the area and using funds to spawn the project. I think that, you know, when we started this project, it was right around the time that we had just the entitlements that are currently in place. So look, I think it's a good project for the whole and for the region. And you know, this along with the 101 funding and starting the 101 express lanes project, which we've been involved in and that was under construction. Those are regional measures, and we took them on as a company, similar to our housing, investments. Again, like getting into more specifics on it, I'm afraid I'll have to get back to you because I don't have anything else to share beyond what I'm able to give you in the report tonight, I'm afraid.
Yeah, let's wait until things start cooking again. But certainly, I mean, in terms of projects and visibility and importance to the transportation infrastructure of this city, you know, I'd hesitate to say that on a longer range, I can't think of a more important project. So certainly want to double back on that as it relates to 715, you know, but further down the road for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the one point is that I don't ever think it was envisioned just to be a Facebook, you know, it would never have penciled to be just a Facebook project for Facebook employees. You know, the ridership that comes across from the east to the west every day is predominantly regional. I mean, we have a very, very small percentage of it, so I don't know if that would have made a significant impact at all in terms of making the project financially viable. But I'm happy to, you know, I understand what you're saying. It is an important it is an important project for the area and specifically for Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. For us, I think, we've been, along with this and 101 corridor, looking at ways to invest in regional transit solutions. So certainly I hear you with the importance of the project, and I'd be happy to give you more of an update and more detail and take it offline. To you and the rest of the rest. And I apologize, I don't have more information to share on that tonight.
Thank you. Looking to any other commissioners for that's my son in the background. It's bedtime. Looking for any other commissioners for comments, and in the absence of that, I will proceed to make a motion on this. Well, I'll make a motion first, and should there be any other comments, of course, offer them and then look for a second. So I'll make a motion that we find and make a determination that Facebook over the course of the past year has demonstrated good faith compliance with the provisions of the development agreements, DA for the East Campus, West Campus, and West Campus expansion projects for the period of October 2018 through December 2019. So I'll look for any additional commissioner comments and or motion at this time. Commissioner Kale, I think you're first.
I was just going to second your motion.
Okay, so we have a first from Barnes, a second from Kale. Commissioner Riggs, I assume you had no comment. Okay, so with that, we've got a first from Barnes, a second from Riggs, and what I'll do is I will go down in order, or I'll go through the commissioners, and if you can respond affirmative with your vote. Commissioner Doran. Commissioner Doran is yes. Thank you. Commissioner Riggs. Commissioner Riggs is a yes. Commissioner DeCarty. Commissioner DeCarty is a yes. Commissioner Kale is the seconder, so I'll just re-ask the question for clarity. Commissioner Kale is a yes. Commissioner Kennedy. Commissioner Kennedy is a yes. Commissioner Tate is absent, and Commissioner Barnes, the maker, is a yes. The motion passes, and for the record, it's Doran, Riggs, DeCarty, Kale, Kennedy, and Barnes, all voting yes, and Commissioner Tate absent. Thank you. Congratulations, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm really excited about our project in Belhaven, and can't wait to show it to you. So we'll see you next weekend. Thank you again. Thank you for your service, and thank you to be there. Cheers.
Thank you. And with that, we will proceed to the second item on tonight's agenda. We're going to go from public hearing to item G, which is regular business, and this is item G1. This is to receive an overview and provide input on the update to the city's transportation impact analysis guidelines to incorporate vehicle miles traveled, VMT, as a metric for analyzing potential transportation impacts from the proposed development projects under the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, prior to July 1st, 2020, as required by Senate Bill 743. And with that, good evening, Mr. Chen.
Good evening, Chair. Thank you very much for having me. Before I begin, I just want to make sure that we are all coordinated logistically. So, and then if I can, Magnus, if I can just have a confirmation from you that you can hear me and you can speak through the speaker as well.
I'm here.
Great, thank you. Okay. It appears I do have control. Apologies, it seems like there's a little bit of a lag going on. Can't see.
Hey, Kevin, this is Leo. If you want to make it full screen, go to the view.
Okay.
Third tab, yeah, view, and then it should be down near the end. Fourth one from the bottom.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll minimize myself. I think. Pedro? Well, apologize. Looks like I have a little bit of a lag when I try to navigate my slides, so do bear with me as we go through this presentation. So, thank you, Chair Barn and Commissioners. My name is Kevin Chen. I am the Senior Transportation Engineer with the City of Menlo Park, so happy to be here tonight. With me tonight is Magnus Barber, Senior Associate with CHS, which is the consulting company that we have retained to help us lead this Herculean effort. So definitely thanks to Magnus for putting in a lot of effort to where we are tonight. So I just wanted to briefly introduce us and also
Mr. Chen?
briefly go. Yes, sir.
Before we get started, just as a matter of procedure, are there any updates to the staff report as published? Any
There is
updates
no
from your end?
update.
Great. And before we jump in, I'll just quickly check out to my fellow commissioners to see if they have any clarifying questions before we get started on the on your presentation. Are there any questions for Mr. Chen before we jump into the presentation piece of it? Thank you. Seeing no commissioner questions, the floor is yours, Mr. Chen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chairman. So as we're saying, just wanted to briefly go over the agenda for tonight. I will also share a bit of scoping feedback that we have received from the City Council. Magnus will then take over and discuss the TIA guideline updates, as well as one of the recommendations, which is the VMT component of the TIA methodology. I will then take over to speak about the level of service aspect for the update, and then of course followed by the schedule and next step, and then at the end, certainly more than happy to answer any questions that the Commission and the public might have. So of course, before we got here tonight, we initially went to the City Council for a study session. The study session was mainly to discuss the scope of work for this effort. Back in January 14th, we were able to share the scope of work at the time with the City Council. And after their review, they were able to provide some really valuable feedbacks, and the feedbacks are shared with you here on the screen. The first one is obviously to proceed with incorporating VMT as a new metrics. It is a requirement by law. Of course, Magnus is going to speak to that a little bit later. The other aspect is there's a desire to retain level of service as a local level congestion transportation metric. So as you know, currently the CEQA guideline, or in the past, the CEQA guideline was to use level of service as a transportation impact. Now with the SB 743, there's a desire still for the City Council to retain that, and I'll speak to that a little bit later as well. And then finally, out of the entire update, we want to ensure that there's a preservation of equity throughout the city, and of course, this is primarily geared towards mitigations, etc. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Magnus.
Thanks, Kevin. Commissioners, panelists, the public, I'm Magnus Barber with CHS Consulting Group, and I'll walk through the CMT component of the Transportation Impact Analysis Guidelines update. So as Kevin said, this is required by State Bill 743, and local jurisdictions need to adopt vehicle miles traveled by July 1st of this year. And
The big change as far as we're concerned is how we're going to measure the impact, the transportation impact of new projects. So as Kevin said previously, for CEQA, that was level of service. And going forward from July 1st, only vehicle miles traveled is going to be considered a transportation impact. Now at the local level, VMT also, vehicle miles traveled, also has to be adopted. But jurisdictions have the discretion to maintain level of service, and that's what the direction we got from the council. And it will also have some changes on how transportation impacts are mitigated, and we'll get into that. And this isn't, this isn't a policy that's coming down standing on its own. This is something that's been building over a period of years and is generally aligned very well with other policies that Menlo Park's already adopted. For example, in the general plan circulation element, the climate action plan, the downtown and El Camino Real specific plan, and the transportation demand management guidelines, all of which aim to improve public health and reduce environmental impacts of transportation. So to briefly recap what SB 743 is about, if you look at the pie chart on the right, you'll see that in California, transportation is the single largest contributor to climate change at 41%. And there are various ways we can go about reducing that contribution. Can increase the efficiency of vehicles, and we can reduce the carbon content of fuels. Both of those things are ongoing, but it's not really enough to reduce emissions to where we need them to be. And so the remaining pillar that we can work on is reducing the amount of vehicle travel that we need to do. And so SB 743 aims to align the transportation analysis with the state's goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to promote multimodal transportation networks and a diversity of land uses. And getting into the impact assessment itself, I'll talk first about how we developed the screening network, and then we'll talk about how the analysis itself goes forward. So the framework's based on data from Menlo Park's travel demand model. And briefly about what the travel demand model is, it divides the city into zones, transportation analysis zones, TAZs. You can see that map on the right there. They're all little varying size, but each zone contains information about the population in that zone, the jobs in that zone, trips in, out, and through that zone, and the average length for different trip types. So if you're going from home to work or home to the store or all kinds of trip types, that information is embedded in there. And then the model looks at how many trips are generated from each type of land use, and how are those trips distributed, where are they going, and how are people choosing to make those trips? Are they driving, are they walking, are they biking, are they taking transit? And by crunching all those numbers, the model is able to generate an average vehicle miles traveled for each TAZ zone for work trips and residential trips. And that's what this framework's based on. And so the screening methodology that we're looking at is basically defining three tracks, three different ways that projects can estimate their VMT for the purposes of the transportation impact analysis. In the first category, which is relatively small, is some projects are exempt. Projects that generate fewer than 100 trips a day, slightly below the state recommendation, but it's in line with CCAG's analysis. So that's in order to harmonize with CCAG. Local serving retail, very important, and it can reduce the length of trips residents have to make if they have a store locally. And residential and office developments that are in zones with VMT below the average, below the threshold, we'll get into what the threshold is later, and also within half a mile of transit. So on the right, you can see the half-mile walkshed, basically where you can reach within 10-minute walk of the Caltrain station in downtown Menlo Park. The second track is for routine projects such as residential office projects that are larger than a certain size and not in a low VMT zone. CCAG is developing a sketch model tool. It's going to be a spreadsheet-based tool, and you can see similar ones if you're curious to see what's coming. San Jose, Los Angeles have both developed these already. They're quite user-friendly, and they'll help projects quite quickly estimate their vehicle miles traveled and what kind of mitigations they might need to do in order to get below the threshold if they do exceed the threshold. And then the final track is for larger projects or unusual projects. So it might be large regional employers or regional retail, things like that, that could generate more than 800 trips a day. They need to use the Menlo Park travel demand model to estimate their VMT impact more precisely. So getting into what's considered an impact, what is that threshold? So the recommendation from the state's Office of Planning and Research is that for residential trips and employment trips, they are considered an impact if the VMT is above 15% below the average. That's a bit convoluted, but basically, if you look on the middle column here, this is the average vehicle miles traveled in Menlo Park and regionally. So, for example, the average vehicle miles traveled per job within Menlo Park is 14.9 miles. And the threshold is set based on that. So it's 15% below 12.7 miles is the threshold for vehicle miles traveled per job. And the residential threshold is based on the regional average trip length of 16.1 miles, which means the threshold is 15% below that. It's 13.7 miles. So for some other land uses, for example, retail, hotel, and schools, the threshold guidance from the state is it's an impact if it increases VMT above what it is today. And for mixed use projects, each component of that mixed use would be considered independently. So for example, if it has retail on the ground floor with residential development above, they would each be judged against their respective threshold values. And then getting into how would a development mitigate their VMT impacts if they were found to be above the threshold. So this is going to look similar to the existing transportation demand management program that the city already has, but it goes beyond that, and it has a different way of summing up the reductions. So transportation demand management is a big component of it. It can get up to 25% trip reduction. So that's things like commute trip reduction programs, transit subsidies, parking cash out, things like that. The previous presenter was a good example of doing quite a good job reducing commute trips in Menlo Park. Parking management can gain up to 20% trip reduction. Such things as unbundled parking, where tenants pay separately for parking, paid parking at market rates, and reduced supply. Transit improvements could net up to an additional 10% reduction, increasing proximity or access to transit, or increasing the service frequency of transit. And then active transportation, rounding out the various categories, can get up to 5% by completing pedestrian and bicycle networks. And another way that this differs from the existing level of service-based mitigation is how is this intended to be funded? So the LOS in lieu fee program is based on LOS impacts, and so it wouldn't be appropriate to apply that funding program to VMT-based impacts. And so there needs to be some additional study to look at what would be a fair and equitable way of funding these reductions, which would be through a future study. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin to walk through LOS revisions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that come up at the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Magnus.
Kevin, can we,
yes.
Before we jump into that, because that was a fairly dense piece of work that we just heard, let me check in with my fellow commissioners just to see if they have any questions, because I don't have any visual cues on who might be wanting to ask a question. So if there are any questions up to now from any commissioners about that piece of it before we jump into the LOS revisions, please hit your video button. Okay, great. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair Barnes. So as we mentioned a little bit earlier, with SB 743, this also gives us a good opportunity to look at our existing level service guidelines. Really, this is an opportunity for us to bring the current guideline up to standard to be in compliance with SB 743. So with that in mind, there are potentially two elements that we could update with this guideline. The first one is to look at the exempt projects. Currently, under our guidelines, we exempt any projects that are less than 5 units, developments that will have a net new square footage of 10,000 square feet or less. Of course, land use changes and other CBOR requirements at the time would be exempt if it falls under those categories. With this in mind, what we're recommending is to modify the exemption list to match that of the CBOR. What that truly means really is that the only change to be made is to the residential units. With regard to retail, commercial, we're still retaining the less than 10,000 square feet. However, with residential, we are seeing a slight uptick to the units. It will go from 5 units to about 13 units for a single family unit, or 10 units for single family housing development, or 13 units for multifamily development. Also, the second element that it is now afforded us to update is to formalize the way that we identify a study area. So typically, a study area from the level service standpoint involves intersection analysis as well as roadway analysis. So with this idea, we are now afforded the opportunity to formalize that, and the two bullet points are essentially what we are recommending to be updated as part of this effort. Of course, those are the technical side of things. There are also two other considerations that we want some feedback from the Commission tonight as well. One is the idea of formalizing those local level service guidelines into the zoning code. The reason for doing that is with CEQA update, there is now no longer a state requirement for level of service. Of course, at the guidance of the City Council, there's a desire to retain that as a local metric, and this would be a good way to codify that. Of course, with the VMT analysis, as Magnus mentioned before, those are dependent on existing values. For instance, how the service population of employees versus residents, the VMT, etc. So there is a desire that perhaps we should conduct a more frequent review. For instance, in this case, we'll do a biennial review that coincide with the Connect Menlo General Plan, as that is a good process to look at some of the land use changes, some of the geometric changes to the roadway as well. Of course, before I conclude, I just wanted to briefly go over the project schedule. Here is a snapshot of the schedule in front of you. Tonight, we are in front of the Planning Commission for your feedback. The desire is that we will gather the feedback tonight from the Commission as well as the members of the public. We will go back and solidify those feedbacks, merge them into the draft format that you are seeing tonight, and then hopefully by June 9th, we'll be able to go to the City Council with a draft format, with hopefully the desire of getting the adoption on June 23rd to match the requirement of a July 1st adoption date.
Am I the only one who's frozen?
Chair Barnes, this is Leo. It appears that Kevin is frozen. It may be a Wi-Fi issue on his end.
I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me okay?
Welcome back.
Okay, my apologies. Looks like I got lost for a second there. So perfect. So this is the slide that I really want to focus a bit of attention on. This is a list of questions that we're looking for feedback from the Planning Commission. So I'm going to go through them one by one. Just take up a couple minutes every time. The first question, obviously, is do the recommended VMT criteria adequately reflect the current city policies and value on the local level? So obviously, as Magnus had mentioned, we need to satisfy the state requirement, but from a local standpoint, we also have an opportunity to see if we want to match those VMT criteria or potentially strengthen them as well. The second question is the city interested in exploring a new in-lieu fee program separate from the current TIF program as a potential mitigation measure for VMT impacts? So again, this is referring to a brand new in-lieu fee program that would focus specifically on projects that are meant to improve VMT impacts rather than the TIF impact, which was a multi-level service focus that was previously approved not that long ago. The third question is, are the recommendations to formalize the local level service scoping acceptable? Again, this is focusing on the two specific elements. One is to formalize it in the sense of adopting it to the zoning code. And then the second one is creating this biannual review process. The fourth question is the city interested in formalizing the local level service guidelines into the zoning code to ensure the full compliance? So as I mentioned, that was one of the ones that we'll definitely be seeking feedback from the commission on. Lastly, is the recommended biannual review. That's another one that we're certainly hoping to get some feedback from you tonight. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. I also would like to point out that as part of this effort, we have went back and looked at 3 previously approved projects that we have an opportunity to look at the VMT impact and potentially isolate them and look at what those projects would have meant if we had looked at it from the VMT standpoint. So we have those slides readily available for you that we can present to you if those questions arise during the Q&A session. Okay. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Great. I'll look to fellow commissioners for clarifying questions about what we just heard before we jump into public comment and further discussion. So I'll lead with a couple questions. Would you go back to the slide that talks about the zones and had some of the different markers for identifying trips? Yeah, right there. So go forward one. Okay. So these, let me understand what this is. This is data from a Menlo Park travel demand model. So first question is, do we currently have the ability to do this modeling right here? Is that something to be developed, or is it something that currently is developed?
This model exists, and it's been calibrated and to current conditions, and it's available to run either by the city or consultants.
How are we getting the to and the TOs, the to and froms and throughs? So you've got a zone, right? And you've got street here, street here. How are we tracking the origination and destination, if that's what I think I'm seeing here, for trips through a particular zone or to and from a zone, within a zone?
So trip origins are based on the land uses within that zone. So in the way that I'm sure you're familiar with from existing TIA reports. So the Menlo Park model is kind of a portion of the larger CCAG model, which covers the entire county. And so that includes the land uses in all the other surrounding cities, which act as destinations for some of these. And I mean, this is all kind of, my understanding is it's not tracking, individual trips so much as being based on averages. But I don't personally run this model, so Kevin may be able to give you a more detailed and informed answer.
Right. Well, unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with model running as well. But based on my understanding, the teacher, the TAZs obviously would have a origin and a destination, and there is a script behind the entire model that designate where the trips are going from and going to, and they will look at the geometric network between the two locations and identify a path that is best suited to make that trip. And of course, it would also look at the roadway capacities as one of the criteria in determining how a trip go from place A to place B. Generally speaking, that's typically what the model would do. The model would be then look at the trip generation from each of the origins, assign those trips to the various paths, and then obviously tabulate that into whatever output that you have desired. In this case, it was tabulated to so that we could obtain vehicle mile travel for employees and residents of Menlo Park.
So by way of example, I live in, Mr. Smith lives in Fremont, right? Mr. Smith he works at Trader Joe's off of Santa Cruz. So from a data aggregation, privacy, individuation standpoint, do we know that Mr. Smith lives in Fremont? Do we know where he's going? And do we know him? How do you know where he got out of bed and is coming from in that scenario, that he's coming from Fremont? How is that possible?
Gotcha. Well, there's certainly, I think in that case, there's two different levels of details that we're looking at. I think what you're describing is kind of a day-to-day activity of an individual that will be traveling from point A to point B. The model is not sufficient down to that level. The model is meant to be a high-level aggregate. When the model look at a TAZ, it's looking at the general population for that TAZ. It's looking at the general employment of that TAZ. It's not looking at the specific individuals. Obviously, it's aggregated, and there will be some assumptions being assigned to it. For example, X amount of percent of the population within that TAZ will travel there, place A, place B, etc. It would not necessarily go down to the granular of let's look at Mr. Smith leaving home, going to a coffee shop, going to work, going to a supermarket, although it is being captured in a way, but it's more of an aggregate in this case.
Okay,
and we're looking at assumption numbers rather than we're looking at that time of the model was developed, what were some of the assumptions based on the relationship of the land uses.
Right. To add to that, individual behavior doesn't really matter so much in terms of VMT because we can predict how the distribution and density of land uses affects average trip length. Right. So what we want to achieve is not to stop Mr. Smith commuting from Fremont to Trader Joe's. We just want over time for Fremont and Menlo Park and other places to develop, slightly denser, slightly larger mix of land uses so that people on average don't need to go so far to meet their daily needs.
Yes, and I get I get the intent of the VMT. Let me go back to Mr. Smith or 10,000 Mr. Smiths, right? How do you know whether he's from the Willows? How do you know whether he lives on McKendree Drive here in Menlo Park, or in Redwood City, or in Fremont, or in San Jose, or wherever? Are you able to divine where anyone going to a particular location is coming from? And is that what this is portending to do?
I believe so in aggregate. I mean, this type of model's been around for decades now and been tweaked by the people who specialize in that and validated against land use developments over time. And so I believe there's fairly high confidence in the output from the model.
The reason why I say that is for instance, we went through a whole process here in the Willows as it related to cut-through traffic, and there was all the discussion about origination, destination, ODs, and where people are coming from, and all the issues associated with that. And if you just take it on a bigger scale, I guess I'm more curious than anything how the to, from, through, and whether you know someone coming from Stanford Research Park passing through here, going over to, by way of example, Fremont. Yeah, I don't know the back end of the data. I'm really curious about that, and the veracity of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are other newer approaches that could be used to validate this. For example, streetlight data that uses aggregate mobile phone data and can actually look at anonymized pairs of origins, destinations. But I mean, the precise origin destinations isn't really the intent here. It's more about the aggregate trip length.
Yes, and I don't mean to steer it into, I was using it by way of example, Mr. Jones and Fremont, but even on an aggregate level, that's fine as well. And you have the streetlight data to do that. It was more, how are we telling, and you seem to be answering it, there is some mechanism for aggregating across this based on, whether it's cell phone data, whether it's streetlight, whether it's whomever doing that. And the seminal question is, obviously you feel comfortable, and Kevin, you feel comfortable that this stuff is accurate. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. For the purpose of what we're trying to do here, this model is, again, from a macro level standpoint, definitely is adequate to do the job that we're hoping to achieve here. For instance, what you're alluded to about cut-through traffic through the neighborhoods, those would be something else that we want to look at separately, not through this model. This model would be too macro for that type of analysis.
Right, but the reason why I said that is that just relates back to the privacy issues with origin and destination, right? Getting the ODs on all that stuff. So that was simply to point out there's historically been such a challenge with trying to figure out where people are coming from, where people are going to, and who's cutting through, whether it's at a city level or a street level. And it sounds as though that's been solved for.
Well, the cut-through traffic is certainly a fascinating problem, and since you brought up Fremont, they've done a lot of work looking at cut-through traffic over the last few years. So if you wanted to reach out to their transportation department, Hans Larsen there, they've been working with the various wayfinding apps to try to reduce the number of people that are directed through residential neighborhoods, and they've been somewhat successful with that.
Yeah, I think okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask you to go to the second slide, which is the slide which was recommended VMT reporting threshold. Was that the slide? It had the per capita. Right, okay. So just getting back to VMT, it's a to from number that we're talking about here. This, for instance, a 16.1 or a 14.5 on the VMT per resident. What's the unit and what does it stand?
Right. So if I understand you correctly, you're asking, is this a one-way trip or a round trip? And this is per trip, a one-way trip.
So this is a one-way trip, and the unit is miles. Is that correct? 14.5 miles.
Correct.
16.1 miles.
Yeah.
So this is the average vehicle mile traveled for a Menlo Park resident. So the VMT resident, I'll jump to the next one, the VMT per job. So that's 14.9 to go to and from their place of work every day. Is that what I'm to understand from that?
Correct.
And then the VMT per resident, that's tooling around in the city for various reasons during the course of a day. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the office residential threshold, average, and then that is, explain that again one more time if you go for the office residential threshold. Is that going to a different, whether you're going to the office, whether you're going to?
Right. So the guidelines from the Office of Planning and Research recommended that the VMT thresholds be set at 15% below the existing average. So for example, for VMT per job, where the existing average is 14.9, the threshold is set 15% below that, so it's 12.7.
So those numbers are 85% of the numbers to the left. And at that impact threshold, that is the number at which a project should not exceed. In a sense, that's what it's saying.
Well, yeah. So it's saying the projects that look like they would exceed that number would need to do some mitigation measures to bring their VMT below that number. So, for example, by doing some parking management or transportation demand management and embodying that into the project.
And all of that, so those extra ways of skinning up your numbers, if what would otherwise be a trip count, in this case, skinning up your vehicle miles traveled, as they look to do some of those methods, that goes back into the model that we were talking about a moment ago, the TMZ model, and it gets punched into whatever algorithms are in there. And again, it gets modeled for what the VMT would be for a particular project.
Right.
Is that correct? Right.
So the screening methodology would dictate how the project, or what analysis the project would need to do. So for example, if they were in a TAZ zone with below average VMT, it didn't generate lots of trips per day, and maybe it was local serving retail. There are also some other land uses that are exempt, such as public services like fire or police, and also affordable housing to preserve, ensure that equity is preserved, and we need more housing all over the Bay Area. So, for example, if any of those criteria were met, they wouldn't need to do any additional analysis for VMT. They might still have to do LOS analysis because we're still retaining that, but that's the extent of the VMT analysis they would need to do. Now, if they were to look at the TAZ they were locating the project in and found that they were, the average VMT in that zone was above the threshold, and they didn't meet any of these exemption criteria, and they were residential or office development, then they would need to use the CCAG sketch tool, which is coming this fall. And then again, if they're a large trip generator, then they need to do the full travel demand model analysis. But that's only for the larger projects.
And that CCAG sketch tool provides, it looks at the overall flows and provides recommendations on how to bring down VMT. Is that effectively what it does?
So yeah, my understanding is that it's a spreadsheet tool. You would enter, the number of square feet of each type of land use for the project and the project location. And based on that, it'll have access to, the average VMT in that zone, et cetera. And then it would generate recommendations for, TDM measures, parking management measures, other things that that they could elect to apply to their project to bring the MT down below that threshold.
Got it. And then CCAG is the keeper of that tool, correct?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Okay. So, all right, got it. All right. Thank you. I think I saw a question from Mr. Riggs. Mr. Riggs.
Yes, thank you, Chair Barnes. More of a prompt, I think, to Mr. Barber, if I may. We had a similar conversation at the commission, I don't remember, 3 or 4 years ago, with a traffic consultant who was indicating the expected impacts of a major project on a freeway segment and therefore on an exit ramp and therefore on the arteries and contributing streets. And I pursued similar questions to Mr. Barnes' questions just now. And ultimately what was revealed, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that studies are done, for example, measuring the use of exits and entrance ramps. So say a great deal of entering the freeway system is done in San Jose, is what the example we were using, and a certain number got off at Willow or Marsh in Menlo Park. It was then presumed what percentage was likely to be from San Jose to Menlo Park, and that data was entered as if it were empirical data. Then that data collection is simply turned on its head, and the data that we put in is pulled out again as if it's a result and a conclusion. And while I understand that there's a certain logic to a certain number of people coming from San Jose where a condo or an apartment is notably less than in Menlo Park, and that the job centers happen to be in Menlo Park, and you can parse out of the San Jose apartment residents how many go to San Jose, how many go to Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, Mountain View, Redwood City, and so forth. So I just wanted to point out, as long as we got this far in the discussion, that at least to my understanding, this data is a product which is based on assumptions which are then returned to us as a model. And Mr. Barber, if you clarify or correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I had understood at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something there. My understanding is that a lot of the models that are used, and this is more of a philosophical angle that's kind of beyond this presentation possibly, but that a lot of them are broadly kind of predict and provide. And so it's somewhat of a self-validating in a way, in that over time, if you keep predicting that, oh, everyone's going to drive and we need to provide more roads so that everyone can drive, and then you build those roads and make it impossible for people to do anything else, then you end up with a place where everyone drives. But that's the current state of the practice. But I think it's really, really interesting with this process we have now, where it's essentially attempting to back away from that and say, what is it we really want to achieve as an end outcome? And let's keep reassessing that going forward.
So thank you.
Thank you. Any other commissioner clarifying questions? And if not, I'll go to public comment and then bring it back up for additional discussion. So Mr. So we'll go to public comment. Mr. Tapia, do we have anyone for public comment?
Thank you, Chair Barnes. I do want to add before you close the comment period for this item, we did receive one comment from a member of the public via email, which could be read aloud and projected before you close the period. But at this time, again, for those who are attending the meeting, feel free to click on the green hand icon on your screen, or alternatively, there's a question tab on your menu where you can write in your question and staff can read it aloud.
And while we're waiting for that, yeah, Kevin, Mr. Chen, why don't you jump in and read that piece of public comment, and then at the end of that, I'll call for anyone who has their hand up.
Great, thank you, Chair Barnes. So I'll be reading a comment letter that we received from Adina Levens, who is a Menlo Park resident, also a complete street commissioner, but of course the comment hereafter is on behalf of herself as a resident. Quote, I am glad that the staff consultant reports are looking at other city experiences with this transition for lessons to Menlo Park, and that they are looking to develop more effective TDM assessments than the San Mateo County's point-based system. One important thing I am seeing as missing is looking at alternatives to auto-level service, considering impact benefits for biking, walking, and transit. City Council wanted to look at multimodal alternatives. I would encourage this to be considered in the scope. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mr. Tapia, do we have anyone who has since raised their hand for public comment?
It doesn't appear that no one has submitted a question or raised their hand to speak at this time.
Great, thank you. So with that, you're not seeing anyone, I will proceed to close public comment and bring it back up to the dais for additional discussion. Mr. Riccardi.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, for the background, really appreciate it. I have one question, Mr. Chen, through the chair to Mr. Chen. In the 5 questions you posed for us, your second question was, is the city interested in exploring a new in-lieu fee program separate from the current TIF program as a potential mitigation measure for VMT impacts? And then I believe what you said is the reason behind that is that the current TIF program is essentially associated with level of service. I wonder if you could provide sort of more clarity about what you meant by that comment.
Absolutely. And the reason why I wanted to make the distinction is because this would be a brand new in-lieu fee program. The purpose behind this particular program would be the idea of allowing a developer to pay into this fee as a potential percent reduction to the impact or a mitigation measure entirely. That's all to be determined. So in this case, what I would envision is that this particular fee structure would be more towards projects that are meant to be more for VMT reductions. So for instance, active transportation networks, the connectivity of pen and bike infrastructures, a more robust TDM program, perhaps a regional TMA, which is the Transportation Management Association. Those are the type of measures that we will be looking into rather than looking at street roadway infrastructures. That's potentially something that we can explore. Of course, something of an in-lieu fee program would be much more complicated and obviously would warrant a study by itself. And that's why, without getting into too much of the details, which typically would be hammered out as part of the analysis, we just wanted to bring that to the commission's attention that this could potentially be a mitigation measure.
Great, thank you.
And if I may tag on to that, just to say that another justification for it is that with the LOS mitigations that have typically been something very concrete, like add a turn lane, change the signal timing, something like that, that you could very directly say, this impact to this intersection is created by the current project, they should pay for it. The solutions to VMT impacts are much broader across the whole city, and so it may be easier for the city itself to make these broad changes to the bicycle network, for example, providing a complete safe network. It's much easier to coordinate at the city level than for any individual project to try to contribute to that. So that makes it potentially easier to do through a mechanism like this.
Great, thank you. As long as I'm here, I'll try to answer your questions from my point of view. First of all, moving from LOS to VMT makes a world of sense to me. Our whole point is to be able to get people to where they need to go and not just to speed cars getting to where they need to go. And so this is a step in the right direction. I would also agree with the one public comment that, and I think it's builds on what you were just talking about, which is it's great to look at vehicle miles traveled. It would be great to actually have a metric that was even more directly people related about the mix and mode of transportation in our community that can best get people to where they need to go. And that, as we've learned, is not from just building more and wider to get cars through faster. So that's my sort of philosophical overarching feedback, which is this transition from LOS to VMT is great. It would be great, in fact, to continue to develop and to work with other communities, even better measurement tools in the future. So to your first question, I think this is a good start. To your second question, I think it makes a lot of sense that if the whole point is to actually capture resources that can move us away from just speeding cars through our community, which won't work, then I think exploring a separate program would make sense. On LOS, I would be interested in understanding how expensive this will be to maintain LOS. It's no longer a requirement. It's actually not particularly, I think, helpful for the type of community we want in the future. And so therefore, I wonder about the amount of resources it will take to develop this new scoping and then actually to implement this on projects. Which gets to your fourth question, which is I am not in favor of formalizing this in the zoning code and to ensure full compliance. I actually think we should move to VMT and then find an alternative. And I do think having some guidelines regularly reviewed, given how urgent this is for our community still, how fast this is all changing, both by developments in the transportation and land use and building sector, that would be a good idea. And then finally, I am also a little concerned about, this may or may not be related, but enforcement, and then also how much money actually gets raised and goes to what kind of projects and how beneficial they are. And we had, at a very micro level, an issue come before us where a successful business owner wanted to replicate the business in another location. There was a single impact of one additional parking space that was needed, but the mitigation was $20 a month for an employee to use public transit, which just seemed laughable. And so I'd also just, as long as we're looking at all of this, encourage on the back end both the enforcement and also that the resources get the impact that you want in order to mitigate in this mix. But thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the time. You can treat my question about the amount of effort on LOS as rhetorical unless it's an easy answer.
Thank you. Mr. Chen, did you want to weigh in on that potentially rhetorical question in terms of what Mr. Zicardi just asked?
Yeah, absolutely. As far as the direction that was provided to us, there is a desire from the City Council to retain level of service as a local metric. So what that means is that a project coming in would need to look at whether or not they need to do VMT analysis, as well as looking at whether or not they need to do level of service analysis. At this moment in time, we are not recommending any changes to the technical aspect of that scope. So I would presume that the amount of effort required for a project will continue to be so with level of service. Of course, we're going to look at mitigation slightly differently because, of course, we need to be cognizant about the VMT, the effect of a level of service introduced feedback, what that mitigation, what that would do in terms of VMT. So that's something that we'll need to be cognizant about. But other than that, I think the scope of a traditional level of service study would most likely still be required. I will put into the little caveat that we are updating the exemption. Of course, that only impacts residential development, not by much, but a slightly increase in units allowed before needing to do level service analysis.
Thank you. Mr. Riggs.
Yes, thank you. So I also would like to respond to the prompts for commission feedback. I'm going to pass on the first one because I think basically VMT has been assigned to us and there's not a whole lot of response that we can give to it. And in terms of a new in lieu fee program, my initial reaction is that besides being redundant, although I can see the point of trying to use it for something different, I think perhaps this is a problem. Menlo Park needs investment in a great number of its traffic lights, for example. And traffic lights do not simply serve single vehicle occupancy automobiles. Besides trucks and buses, they actually serve the pedestrians and the bikers as well. Pedestrians in particular, I've been recommending for, I think, many years that we have a dual crosswalk system, for example, where you have two buttons. This was, hardly rocket science when it was brought to toilets, for example. You don't have to use the big button every time and waste water. And similarly, there could be a short crossing button and a longer crossing button that could be symbolized, for example, by someone healthy ready to trot across the street versus someone pushing a cart or using a walker or bringing a child. And the reason this is relevant to all users is that the traffic signal cycle period is what is most impactful to all users. If I come up on a bicycle and assuming I can even reach a walk button, first of all, I don't need the same walk length period as the man or woman with a walker, but secondly, I have to wait the entire cycle before I can go. And we all know a great number of bicyclists simply do not wait the entire cycle. There are too many of them that are 2 minutes. And in our town, there's a great lack of sensors so that you wait for, say, a left turn pocket that has no one in it, or a crossing traffic where there was no traffic waiting at the light. There is no traffic now, and there won't be any traffic through the entire cycle. So the TIF, I think, in my opinion, is notably underfunded, and we would not benefit from splitting potential funds coming in. And then in terms of would I support formalizing the LOS into the code? Yes, and for the same reasons as council, which is LOS is what actually measures the impacts on our neighborhoods. And so the assumptions of VMT, which are very generalized, are an issue. Mr. Chair, did you want to make a prompt? All right, your audio is not coming through. All right, well then just my final point, I would like to ask staff a question through the chair. Regarding the biennial review of the guidelines, is this something that will in effect burden staff and council on a regular basis, even though it's biennial, when a review might be more appropriate if and when there are issues to discuss? So I'd be interested to hear about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ricks. So I will go ahead and try to respond to the last comment, which was the idea of a biennial review. I think that's a great feedback that you provided, and that's certainly something that we can relay back to the City Council. In this case, the idea of using the biennial review really twofold. One is that our current general plan guideline practice is to do a general plan review every 2 years. So we thought that would be a good opportunity for us to also look at this particular guideline, primarily because, as we have mentioned previously, the calculation of VMT required the existing population, both resident and employees, and as well as the trips that they take on a daily basis. So as a result of that, the threshold that we are using to define an impact is the direct result of that calculation. So I think your point is very well taken, that perhaps we should wait until there is a big enough change to do the update. And then what we're hoping for is that with this biannual review, we can look at some of the changes that have taken place in the past and make that determination as to whether or not we want to update the TIA guideline. Because you're absolutely correct. In order for us to update the values that we're using as threshold, it's quite a tremendous effort. So we do not want to take that lightly, and we want to make sure that the updates are absolutely necessary and that we're getting the best results possible.
I think that's a great idea. Through the chair, one more comment, if I may, briefly.
Yes, please.
In the public comment, the writer prompted that we include multimodal alternative. I did just want to point out that of the 5 VMT-based mitigation bullets, the 4th one is indeed active transportation projects, active meaning pedestrian and bicycle networks and so forth, with what may seem a modest 5% potential mitigation, but that is fully 20% as large as TDM. And I think we've seen, and thanks very much to Facebook across the years for helping me with data, that TDM by far outweighs the potential of alternative transit at the pedestrian and bicycle level. So the 5% is generous and is present. I just wanted to point that out. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's also explicitly one of the goals of SB 743 is to encourage multimodal transportation.
Thank you. While I wait for another commissioner, I have a few questions and comments and some commentary as well. First, let me say I do apologize for my frustration as I talk to the TAZs. We've been talking about understanding flows in our city going back years and years, you know, whether it's the transportation master plan process, which we talked about it endlessly. We've talked about it at our different planning commission meetings when large projects come, who's generating the traffic? Is it the subject property? Where they're coming from? Where are they going to? What percentage of it is regional? What percentage is local? All that type of information. So, any information we can get which furthers that, and any tools that come online to give a better understanding of what's happening in our circulation network, from the city jurisdiction up through the regional is certainly welcome development. So, I appreciate and I welcome all of that, and the sooner the better. So thank you for that. Thank you for whoever's, CCAG and the rest of them for creating that. Couple questions. I really appreciated the staff report and how it went into some of the different issues. So I'm going to kind of jump in and ask some questions about what was meant here in a couple different points. First, let me unpack level of service as it relates to CEQA and a project. And by way of example, you've got project A, which has a traffic analysis done on it. You see that at intersection B, if project A happens at intersection B, the level of service will go from C to D, by way of example, and that'll be X years out. However, that degradation of that particular level of service at that stoplight may or may not be attributable to the trips for that project, rather existing conditions, and you've got incremental traffic based on models for what development's going to be in the community. So let me just verify my understanding as it relates to level of service, trips associated with, traffic impact associated with the project, and how that comes out when we talk about service levels at a particular intersection and being able to define a particular project responsible for that, as opposed to existing conditions and then new conditions based on development going on in the area, which would happen anyhow, and this project may have nothing to do with it. Can you provide, did I describe that correctly as I said a baseline for level of service?
I guess maybe I'll go ahead and take that one for a little bit, and then Magnus can chime in with his expertise as well. I think Chair Barn, you are definitely describing that correctly. When we're looking at a level of service analysis evaluation, ultimately what we're looking for is what would that project do to the intersection or roadway segment. So when we do the analysis, we will look at the existing conditions. We would also look at the existing conditions plus the project, and then comparing those evaluations to come up with a numeric value that represents the impact by that project. So ultimately, that's what the level of service analysis would be doing. And it's doing exactly what you're saying, which is taking into account the existing conditions, taking into account, for instance, in the what we call a background scenario, which just means existing plus approved projects. So you got to make some assumption, obviously, to what the approved project means, where they're going, percentage-wise, etc. But ultimately, there will always be a without project and a with project scenario that we're analyzing, that ultimately looking at what the project will do to the network. And that's what the level of service calculation ultimately is about. And of course, what that means is that now we'll have an idea of what that project will do from an impact standpoint to the network. Using your example, if you're going to a level of service C to a level of service D for a particular intersection, it might not be an impact because our threshold is level of service D. But if you're going from a level of service D to an F or to an E, now there's an impact. So those are the things that we will look into. And again, the focus would be on what the project will do to the network.
Mr. Chair, you're muted.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So if there are projects on Main Street in Menlo Park, and if Stanford Research Park is pouring traffic through our arterials to get out to 101 and across the Dumbarton Bridge, that particular intersection may go from C to D irrespective of the project or with the project, because those are all conditions out of the control of that particular project, and it may get there. And we don't really have the ability to ferret out what that particular project's responsible for, other than guesstimating on a trip count. Is that correct? On a car count from that project. Is that correct?
To some respect, yes. And hopefully let me see if I can answer the question correctly. So in this case, your example, Stanford would contribute to X amount of trips to a intersection.
Well, let me just, I'm sorry, I'll just do for clarification. I'm just trying to be specific to give a real life example. You've got a project on XYZ Street, Main Street in Menlo Park, and all the regional traffic is flowing through Main Street on a given day. And then you've got a project on Main Street that someone is proposing. That level of service at that light may or may not, will go on its own trajectory in terms of all the regional traffic coming through. In this project, the best we can do is look at it and say, great, we're going to guesstimate that this many cars are going to be coming in and out of this project and therefore making right turns at this intersection. So we're going to add X amount of trips to the overall regional flow of traffic. That's generally what a level of service analysis is. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So we're looking at trips and we're saying, okay, that many trips at this intersection added to what's going to happen to the baseline is what we guess to happen at that intersection.
That's correct.
Okay. And then as I look at the page 2, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to page 3 in the report, and I'm looking at under LOS definition, benefits and other considerations, and I'll just read what it says here. It says LOS analysis and mitigation measures different from VMT would typically support strategies that encourage faster automobile travel times, reduce peak commute time congestion, and 3, implement roadway widening and other infrastructure or strategies that would encourage travel by single occupancy vehicles. In reading that, is it fair to say that LOS in effect induces demand?
Yes, that's correct. That's the way it's functioned historically, but that's not inherent to the analysis of the impacts of LOS. It's more in the way that mitigations have been practiced historically with adding capacity. And I think Kevin alluded to this earlier, that so for transportation impacts or transportation projects under SB 743, it's considered an impact if that project would induce traffic. And so future LOS mitigation measures would need to consider, is this mitigation going to induce additional traffic? And there could be examples where it would not. For example, improving the signal timing of an intersection would make more efficient use of what is there, but probably wouldn't induce a significant number of trips compared to adding a travel lane, say.
So mitigation measures for LOS impacts may be materially different than mitigation measures for VMT, and you're talking at what we're talking about is 2 very different ways to solve for transportation impacts. So we're looking at how we define what an impact is and how we get to solving and mitigating for them based on the analysis that we do, whether it's LOS or VMT, and those are 2 very different, 2 significantly different paths, correct?
Right. And so they're solving for different parts of the puzzle. And so it's not necessarily redundant to do both. It's just important to make sure that what we do with that information is pulling in the same direction.
Okay, I can say that, I mean, I don't think, in that context, I don't think VMT comes soon enough. I think that there's a reason why it's a best practice, and I think we've labored long enough under level of service, which pays more attention to flows, irrespective of where those flows come from, but puts the onus in the specific jurisdiction, and particularly a geography like Menlo Parks, where if you take, a generic number, you take Willow Road, and the numbers that, greater than 8 out of 10 cars neither originate nor terminate in Menlo Park, for a metric that works for this city, where it is the regional traffic impacts are so distinct, in solving for regional traffic patterns versus solving for Menlo Park specific issues, I think VMT can't come soon enough, because I think VMT is the appropriate measure for developments in this city for looking at what's going to be the best to solve for three things that we say we're in fact solving for. One is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the city, developing multimodal transportation networks in this city, and providing a diversity of land uses in this city. I think VMT is very well suited to Menlo Park, and I think level of service, the phasing out of it can't come soon enough, because I think the canard is that level of service is going to protect us from congestion, and in fact, it may be having the opposite effect of inducing demand in addressing issues that don't accrue and benefit our particular city with the way that we're made up. So if I look at the items you're seeking feedback from, do the recommended VMT criteria adequately reflect city policies and values? I think absolutely. I think it reflects the circulation element well. Interested in a new in lieu fee program. Having spent a year and a half on the transportation master plan, I guess I just can't understand why it is we're now having another discussion about fees and what to do with fees and how to do with fees. So the first question I would ask is, where do we stand in relation to other cities? What's the nexus? Are our fees greater or less? What are we paying for? But my goodness, we did a great deal of work on many projects which weren't just pouring concrete and adding overpasses. If you look at the transportation master plan, the 130 different potential projects in there. I mean, they're bikes, they're sidewalks, they are multimodal, they are everything having to do with increasing mobility choices. So I would say a resounding no to a TIF program. I would say let's get the TIF program up to snuff in terms of what is a reasonable and aggressive reclamation of fees from developers, and then do it under one bucket. The recommendations to formalize local LOS scoping acceptable. I don't, yes, they are from the way that you laid it out, but I don't think we need to be chasing LOS any further. And no, I don't think we need to formalize guidelines into the zoning code. And biennial review of the TIA guidelines adequate. I don't understand the question well enough. My phone cut out there for a moment, so I'll defer on that. I think as a general rule, I don't know. I mean, when our feedback is needed and we can be accretive to the process, yes. So I'll demur on that. But the other ones I feel fairly strongly about. I'll look for any other commissioner comments. Seeing no other commissioner comments, this particular agenda item does not call for a motion. So let me look to staff. Mr. Chen, do you feel like you have what you came for this evening, and have you gotten the type and the quantity of feedback you wanted?
Thank you, Chair Barnes. Yes, I mean, certainly, I think we got clear feedbacks from Commissioners DeCarty, Riggs, and Barnes. I know that the other commissioners did get a chance to provide their feedbacks. While we're not necessarily looking for a vote per se, but we do have those actions, and maybe Karina can speak to that a little bit better than I do. But we certainly want some to make sure that the recommendations being provided are of the general consensus of the commission.
Yeah, through the chair, I just wanted to clarify. I don't think we really spelled this out in the staff report, but we are looking for a motion that would include the commission's feedback with a recommendation to the city council, and then there would be a vote on that motion.
Okay, thank you for that. So give me a little bit of direction here. The motion for the recommendation, the content of the recommendation would, in your mind, encompass these particular bullet points, and the commission hash out to some extent what our consensus view is on the different bullet points. Is that work product that you're looking for?
Yes, so the main point, or the main kind of question, is if the planning commission is making a recommendation to the city council to update the TIA guidelines, and then the second part of that is whatever feedback the commission would like to include, that I think would help staff, transportation staff, when they go to the city council.
And let me kind of dig into that a little bit. The TIA guidelines have to be amended per this state bill. So that's not, it's less of a question of should we, correct? It will happen. And then our recommendation is what do we want to see within those TIA guidelines per these questions, correct?
Yes, I think there is a requirement for the update, but I think the question is the way the TIA guidelines are proposed to be updated. If the planning commission is generally and yes, would be to recommend to the city council to update the guidelines.
Okay, let me look to Commissioner DeCarty. See if you can guide us a little bit here, Commissioner DeCarty, please. Voice, can't hear you.
I don't know if I can guide. I think I'm confused, so I just really want to clarify. There's nothing in the agenda or in the staff report that would lead me to believe that we're supposed to make a motion on something specific. The staff report at the end says that the staff will coalesce the input from the commissioners. This seems very different than how these types of things are usually set up. So I just want to clarify, because that's not, this just wasn't my understanding coming in. So I just want to, I guess, understand, based on Chair Barnes's good question, exactly what motion and what specific language are we supposed to craft here, because that just was not my understanding from both the agenda and reading the materials before.
If I can just jump in here a little bit, I think those are great feedbacks that we can take back in terms of just the structure of the staff report. I think ultimately what we're looking for the commission to provide feedback on, kind of line item by line item, sounds like to the question of should we adopt VMT as the new transportation metric, both statewide and local, the answer is yes. And of course, given the individual items listed in the tables. The second item about update level service criteria as the existing transportation study. So that particular element, there's two things that we're looking for. One is essentially referencing to table 5. The two elements would be one, the update to the exemption projects, which again, I'll just mention that the only thing that got changed would be the number of residential units that will fall under this exemption list. In the past, it was 5 or less. Now it will be 10 or less for single family, 13 or less for multifamily. And the other item for level service would just essentially to formalize the way that we identify a study area. So none of those are technical aspects. They're just simply there to kind of tighten up the loose ends, so to speak. And as far as the exemption is concerned, we're just trying to make sure that we're consistent with CEQA. So that would pertain to bullet point number 2. Bullet point number 3 would be
Kevin.
Yes.
Kevin, I'm sorry. Let me just, because this is somewhat granular. Let me make sure I understand what you just said. So, so bullet point number 1, so we can all understand. It'll be easier if we get it all nailed down first try.
Okay.
So bullet point number 1 is we're not voting on whether to adopt the MT and the TIA. That's a foregone conclusion. It means effectively you referenced table number 5, and what we would be weighing in on is whether table number 5, as presented here, is acceptable to the Planning Commission. Is that what we're talking about, bullet point number 1?
Bullet point number 1 refers to the VMT. VMT then in this case would be tables, tables 1, tables 2, 3, and 4. So those are the tables pertaining to VMT.
1, 2, 3, and 4. And you're asking for our opinion as to whether tables 1, 2, 3, and 4, as proposed, are acceptable to the Planning Commission. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. And for your information, a lot of these are essentially consistent to the OPR guideline, with the exception of a couple minor ones, which we identify in the individual tables.
Okay, so it's 1, thank you for that. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then your reference to table 5, was that in the first bullet point, or was that for another bullet point?
That would be for the second bullet point, where we talk about updating the level of service criteria. So that would be pertaining to table number 5.
Second bullet point is table number 5. And the question is that acceptable?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, point of order. Are we referring to the list of the bullet points on the screen or on some other list?
On the screen.
In that case, I don't follow the conversation regarding bullet number 2. This I don't see. I don't see.
My apologies. Yeah, my apologies. Okay, my apologies. The second bullet, the first and the second bullet that I'm referring to are the bullets under recommendation in the staff report.
Okay, hold on. And those are different than what's up on the screen?
Right. What's up on the screen? What's up on the screen are very specific questions that we wanted to generate the discussion, but ultimately all 5 of those bullets will boil down to the ultimate recommendation.
Yeah, but just a point of clarification: the bullet points on the screen are the same as the Planning Commission feedback. So to make sure I understand, right. So we're back to. We're just going to go through methodology right now. The way to solve for what it is we're solving for this evening is to march through these bullet points and identify the pieces of this staff report that we are being asked to concur with. That's the way I think is a good way to follow through. What do you think?
Yes, let's go ahead and do that.
Okay. And if the bullet point doesn't apply to anything that's in the staff report, that's fine as well. But we'll just note that. So you said bullet point number 1 was tables 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then bullet point number 2 also encompasses say that again, encompasses number 5?
Okay, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the bullets that they're talking about are the Planning Commission feedback slide, right?
Yep.
That's okay. That's correct. Great. Okay. So bullet number 1, the question about VMT, you are correct. That would be tables 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
Bullet number 2, which talks about in lieu fee program, that's just simply a question that we wanted some feedback from the commission. It's related to VMT, but that particular nuance, we're just simply looking for feedback whether or not that's something that we want to explore further.
But a big clarification: feedback's different from a motion on a recommendation. Are you looking for that to be memorialized in a motion that the planning commission makes?
Through the chair, if I may add a clarification, and maybe Lee wants to add something, but I just want to apologize. I think we were not clear in the staff report. One thing we did have in the staff report in the very beginning for recommendation, it says staff recommends that the planning commission recommends the city council to adopt the updated TIA guidelines. So that's kind of where I thought of that point being. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be, any motion doesn't necessarily have to be very detailed. The planning commission could recommend approval of the VMT guidelines and then have a recommendation around any of the other points if the commission would like, but that's not necessary. I think generally whenever the planning commission does make a recommendation to the city council, it is done through a motion and a vote on that motion. So I wanted to clarify that, and we'll make sure any future staff reports are clearer.
Attachment A. I'm looking for attachment. I'm sorry. I'm taking a moment here. My printout jumps from the staff report to attachment B. Am I missing it? Is it just me that's missing the attachment A? Did I not print that out?
Yeah, it goes to attachment B. There is no attachment A.
Attachment A is in the staff report.
I'm sorry, please repeat that.
It's a hyperlink to the staff report. If you click on the hyperlink, it will take you directly to attachment A. Then
Hyperlink City, Menlo Park, Transportation, analysis guidelines. Okay. So in effect, we need to, it says make recommendation to update the current TIA guidelines attachment A. So we need to be familiar with content of attachment A, which I am not. I haven't read this yet.
My apologies to Chair Barnes. Let me see if I can maybe summarize what staff is looking for, and then hopefully we can come to a amenable solution to this. So in terms of feedback that we're getting, I think the voting process would be on whether or not we want to move forward with VMT and level of service as they are presented. So that would be tables 1 through 5, right? Table 1 through 4 pertains to VMT. Table 5 pertains to level of service. So that would be the only thing that we need the commission to vote on is your blessing to move this forward. In terms of the in lieu fee program, in terms of the questions about in lieu fee program, whether or not we want to formalize level of service to the zoning code, as well as whether or not we want to do some sort of a biannual review of the TIA guidelines. I think those are just simply feedbacks that we can take back. We do not necessarily need a vote from the commission. Okay. And I think so far we have received great feedbacks on those questions from Commissioners Decardi, Riggs, and Chair Barnes as well. So certainly the other commissioners are certainly welcome to chime in specifically regarding those topics. But if they do not wish to chime in, we certainly understand that and we can move forward with that.
Thank you. I'll turn now to Commissioner Riggs. Thank you for that, Mr. Chen. Commissioner Riggs.
Thank you. And Kevin, thank you for working out an understanding. I had, through the last 15 minutes, been thinking that Commissioner Decardi expressed what I feel, and I suspect others have felt. There is a pattern to these asking for commission feedback, and they do not require a vote on each of the bullets. So that said, I'd be happy to make a motion to make a general recommendation for this effort to move forward. And if that's sufficient, I will leave my motion at that. Corinna, is that sufficient?
Yeah, I think that generally sounds good. Maybe to clarify that the update should be in line with the information provided in the staff report. So I think otherwise that's what we're looking for.
All right, so the vote will exclude the Planning Commission feedback bullets, which, as Kevin noted, have been taken separately. All right, so that's my motion to recommend the, in general terms, moving forward with the recommended changes in the staff report.
Thank you, Commissioner Riggs. Mr. Chen, I just want to go. I want to go back to attachment A. So, and I haven't had the opportunity to look through it. Is the content in attachment A is intended to be a supplement to what is in the staff report, and it does not raise any additional policy questions. Is that correct?
You're correct. Attachment A is simply a the existing TIA guideline. It's just simply a reference document.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And because the recommendations are important to me, are you able to give an overview of what you believe you heard from the different commissioners in not wordsmithing it, but in general, what in addition to the motion, what the feedback is from Planning Commission?
Yeah, absolutely. I've taken notes down for Commissioners Decardi, Riggs, and of course Chair Barnes on the specific bullet points. I'd be happy to reiterate them back to you at this moment in time if you desire.
Yeah, would you do that briefly, please?
Absolutely. So with regard to Commissioner Decardi, VMT, this certainly makes sense. He would definitely be in favor of exploring a new in-lieu fee program. However, he is not in favor of formalizing level of service to the zoning code. As he described, he prefers something other than level of service. But with that in mind, he is in favor of a biannual review of the TIA guideline. So that would be Commissioner Decardi. For Commissioner Riggs, He certainly understands that VMT is the update is a requirement. So certainly passed the first question. He is a little bit in terms of the in lieu fee. He's comfortable with having an in lieu fee because his understanding is that the current TIP fee, the transportation impact fee, is not as well funded as it could be. Hopefully I conveyed that correctly. Commissioner Rick is also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure if you said comfortable with the in lieu fee. The word would be uncomfortable with the.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. And also Commissioner Rick is in favor of formalizing the level of service guideline into the zoning code. And I believe he is comfortable with the biannual update, although he is certainly want to be cognizant about the burden to staff low, wanting to make sure that the updates are done on an absolutely necessary level. So now one for Chair Barnes.
I'm sorry, again, the chair, I was not comfortable with the biannual review, and I recommended taking an alternative view, and I accepted your response, Kevin, that perhaps this should be looked at by staff prior to automatically bringing it to council. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Commissioner Riggs, for that clarification. So now back to Chair Barnes. I think Chair Barnes certainly is in favor of the VMT criteria, is not interested in an additional in lieu fee program. The Chair Barnes is comfortable with the recommendations for the level of service scoping, is not interested in formalizing the level of service guidelines into the zoning code. And while there wasn't a definitive answer to the last one, I think it's safe to say that you are on the camp of let's go ahead, only evaluate them when it's necessary.
Thank you. I would say two things. One is I just don't have an opinion on the biannual review. I don't know enough about that. When's going to come back. And on my comment on the in lieu fee, my assertion is the TIF should be made strong enough that it serves the purpose of mitigating transportation impacts. And I think the bifurcation of LOS and VMT enhancements, I think is a false bifurcation. Having gone through that transportation master plan process, if you go through that spans all types of circulation enhancements. So I would say make the TIP strong, but we don't need an extra layer of an extra fee on top of. We need the money in aggregate. We don't need to further stratify the types of fees. Make it a strong fee, make it the appropriate fee, and have both all transportation infrastructure, transportation modality enhancements come out of one particular bucket of money, and not have it be one versus another, because it pits one type of thinking versus another. So that's my assertion on that.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. And that was Barnes, Riggs, and DeCarty. If anyone else would like to weigh in as a commissioner, now's your time, please. And also looking for a second to Commissioner Riggs, and I will, I'll second Riggs' motion. So it's a first from Riggs, second from Barnes. And if there's no other commissioner comments, I'll call for a vote. And the vote I will call for, it'll be me calling each commissioner's name, and please give an up or down. I won't call, yes, no, or abstaining. I'll just call and you tell me thumb up, thumb down, or thumb across the middle if you're abstaining, and I'll take that record. So starting with Commissioner Doran. Commissioner Doran's affirmative. Commissioner, I'll go back to you, Commissioner Riggs, just to make sure that you're still on board with your motion. Yep, Riggs is one with his motion. Commissioner DeCarty. Commissioner DeCarty's a yes. Commissioner Kale. Commissioner Kale's a yes. Commissioner Kennedy. Commissioner Kennedy is a yes. I see a thumb. And Commissioner Barnes is a yes, and Commissioner Tate is absent. So for the record, it's all voting yes. Doran, Riggs, DeCarty, Kale, Kennedy, Barnes. Commissioner Tate is absent. That is our motion, and those are our recommendations. And thank you, Mr. Barber and Mr. Chen. And I don't know if Ms. Choi was on the phone, but thank you, Ms. Prince, as well, for helping us through that.
Thank you, commissioners.
Great. And that takes us to informational items. Looking to Ms. Sandmeyer. Item H on tonight's agenda.
Yeah, so we're going to have another meeting next week on May 11th, and that's for the proposed multi-generational community center in Bellhaven, and that will be a study session. And then we'll have another meeting on May 18th, which will be a regular meeting. We have 2 single-family homes scheduled for that with use permits, and then general plan consistency for right-of-way abandonment and easement abandonment related to the proposed new community center. And then we may also have another project, but we haven't completely finalized the agenda. And that concludes my updates, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Any questions for Ms. Sandmeyer? Seeing none, thank you to all my fellow commissioners, and I will call this meeting to adjournment at 10:08 p.m. and see you all, well, I'll call it to adjournment. Thanks, everyone.